Rest in peace, Vizardrix, Giant Cockroach, Watchwolf, one of the good ones.
Watchwolf.
And finally, the best boy, Isamaru.
Distraction makers.
When do you think the last truly vanilla creature was printed?
You know what? Okay, here. Shot in the dark.
Yeah.
I think the first Lord of the Rings set.
You know, honestly,
that would have been a great set.
That would have made sense.
That would have been a great set.
That would have made sense. No, actually, the last time a truly vanilla creature was printed was in 2021.
What?
In Strixhaven. There was technically a 5-color vanilla 8/8, I think, that was printed in Brothers War, which was Fusion Elemental. And then we had Yargle and Multani, which was which is vanilla, but also multicolored. Right. So to go back and get a monocolored creature that's vanilla, you had to go all the way back to 2021 with Strixhaven.
Can you just cut back to me crying when you were reading this?
What are some of the reasons why we think vanilla creatures are important, why we love them, why we think that they should have a place in Magic still?
Personally, I think that Magic has officially been labeled the most complicated game in the world ever made. So any opportunity to try and not make it complicated and bring people in, I think is good.
Yeah.
And I think that newer players that are maybe more ingrained in Magic's culture has picked it up for a few months. I think they take for granted what vanilla creatures offer. And in fact, anyone that's tried to show someone a game of Commander anytime recently, even just a normal game, I'd say like showing someone even on Arena, there's a reason that Arena shows you the game using vanilla creatures. Right. It's because the game is compelling without all of these extra mechanics and text on top of these creatures.
Yeah. I mean, you know, for me, a lot of times I'm looking at things from kind of a storytelling perspective. So part of why vanilla creatures are so interesting to me, one, you get room for flavor text, which is cool.
Yeah.
But more so, if we're looking at sort of the game mechanics as story expression, it's really interesting to see what kind of stories you can tell with just a, power, toughness, and mana cost and what color they're in. Some of the more interesting ones, we have Dross Crocodile, which is a 5/1 in black, and then we have Fortress Crab, which is a 1/6 in blue. And just having the color, mixing with the power toughness, you sort of, it tells a story of what this creature is, right? I mean, obviously a Fortress Crab is, gonna be tougher and have a shell. I don't really know why Dross Crocodile's a 5/1. As far as I can tell, crocodiles are pretty scary, but maybe the Dross Crocodile is weak, very strong, but not very tough.
I don't know the lore of Dross, but I know there's other references to Dross as a thing.
But it's interesting, right? You ask questions.
Yes.
Why is this crocodile so weak?
I think vanilla creatures are where you really...
Stiff breeze gonna take him out.
I don't know that reference.
A stiff breeze?
Oh, a stiff breeze.
Yeah.
I thought we were still talking about Magic cards. It's like, I'm not familiar with that card.
Called Stiff Breeze. There has to be now. It's blue. Target creature gets -1/-1 in blue.
And it kills Dross Crocodile.
It kills Dross Crocodile.
-1/-1. I think... I think you really started to see the flavor of the colors and their identity through vanilla creatures. And I think seeing them all the way down to vanilla creatures is really important. Because I think most people, when they start picking up a game like this, most people probably miss the color identities. Yeah. They view it mostly as blue you could draw more stuff, and red you can do this stuff or whatever.
Or even just seeing it as sort of an artifice on top of the game that's saying I can only play these certain colors or certain cards in certain colors, not necessarily that it's foundational to the way the game works.
Right.
Yeah.
And that if the fact that green was the first or the only thing that could play a 2/2 for so long gave green a very specific identity.
Right. I remember the conversations about Grizzly Bear and Gray Ogre, right? Where Grizzly Bear is a 1 green and a colorless for a 2/2, and Gray Ogre is one red, and 2 colorless for a 2/2 in red, and immediately you're like, oh well, green has the best creatures. I mean, we go to Savannah Lion in white, which is 1 white for a 2/1, and so you start to understand the color pie identity from baseline, which is fascinating. The only other thing that I want to say about what has sort of happened in the times, the times before and versus the times now. Yeah. I remember when our boy Isamaru came out, and there was a huge controversy over the fact that it effectively made Savannah Lions obsolete. Yeah. Even though Isamaru is legendary. Yeah. So there, Savannah Lions is 1 white for a 2/1, and Isamaru is 1 white for a 2/2, legendary. But both of these cards were played in aggro decks, throughout Magic's history. But Savannah Lions had been the baseline from Alpha until Kamigawa when Isamaru comes out. Yeah. And people were like up in arms about this at the time, right? And to contrast that with today is pretty fascinating.
Right. To see what people were upset by back then versus now. Yeah. So I saw Isamaru at a later point. You and I just were talking about Kamigawa and how weird of a set it was. Yeah. One night, and we were looking at Scryfall and going through the lists and stuff, and I stopped at Isamaru and I was like, whoa, like this guy's crazy.
And he's a rare.
And he's a rare. Yeah. And I asked you, I was like, this guy saw play, didn't he? And you were like, oh yeah, Isamaru's like great. And I saw he was legendary, and I was like, oh, that's such a clever way of going around and breaking the color pie by allowing white to have a 2/2, but only you can only have 1 on board at any one time. Yeah, I think is so interesting, and I think really shows some of the subtle little twists that you can have with something as simple as a vanilla creature. Right. And I think personally, I admire vanilla creatures because I think if you're working on any sort of a card game, board game, anything like that, especially TCGs, there's a lot of people trying to make their own TCGs and stuff out there. Yeah. I think it absolutely should be tested first and foremost with just vanilla creatures of whatever your system is.
Yeah, for sure.
Because Isamaru is the perfect example of how you can still find innovation within something like a vanilla creature. Yeah, way later on,
decades later, almost. Yeah,
without completely breaking the game.
There's also something else that's really interesting about Isamaru is that this is they changed the legendary rule when Kamigawa came out. I'm pretty sure that's when it got changed. It may have been with a core set right before Kamigawa, somewhere in that time. It was around that time where previously it was once one player played something that had legendary, that was it. If you tried to play one, yours would just die. So it was a race to get a legend. To get a legend on board, right? And the first one to do it had a huge advantage. And then in Kamigawa, it became, okay, well, if a second legendary hits play, they both die. And so your legendaries became sort of like pseudo removal spells for a while. It was very interesting and kind of also weird, but weird in a different way. Eventually we end up in, the land today where you can only have one legendary, but anybody can have their own version. You could have 2 Isamarus staring each other down on either side of the field, which is a flavor fail, but mechanics, sure. Right. But yeah, so in context, it becomes even more interesting, I think, in that playing Isamaru as a legendary at that time, legendary was a much bigger drawback than what it would be today. Right. So why do we think Wizards has moved away from vanilla creatures?
Because they're bad. Don't you see how bad they are? Look at this one.
How can you say that?
Look at this fire elemental.
How can you say that to our boy Isamaru?
It's 5 mana for a 5/4. Idiot. Stupid. I don't think that's why. I don't think that's why. I think that's what other people probably think.
When we're thinking about how Magic sets are sold now, when you look at sort of how you digest a set as a commander player versus how you would digest a set as a standard or draft player, right? You kind of have to give yourself as many swings at a card to make an impact on players as possible. And so if you're filling up slots in a set with vanilla creatures that look, they're not going to see play in commander decks. They might see play in draft, but they're not going to see play in standard decks either, right? But when the way that the sort of the commander play experience digests a set, you basically show up to a set, you scroll through the set list looking for anything that fits into any kind of deck you already have, and then maybe you look for legendary creatures that you might want to build a new deck for. Yeah. And like that process, you know, could lead you to more and more cards. But if, you know, you're dealing with all of the cards in existence, the idea that you're going to play a vanilla creature, it's just not going to happen. Right.
Draft in particular, I think, is what's so enticing to me about Draft and Cube. We've gotten a lot of people to tell us to play Cube, which I'm sure we will do one of these days.
Yeah.
But the reason that I like Draft so much as a concept is because that it does force players to have to pick something that would seemingly be suboptimal. But what I think is missed out a lot is that most of the time, if you see anybody online discussing Magic, they're not the casual player base.
Right.
Even people that tend to say I'm a casual player, if you are online watching YouTube videos, watching us talk about Magic, you're probably not a casual player.
Right.
Casual players are people that bought a starter deck 2 years ago and occasionally still play with their friends at a kitchen table. And like, they're not online talking about this game constantly.
Right. My favorite anecdote is when I found a YouTube channel that was board game focused, but they're people who were talking about their first Magic experience, and they didn't even understand that you could customize the decks.
Oh,
because they had purchased Doctor Who decks. It was like one person got a Lord of the Rings, one got a Doctor Who deck, and they're like, "That's the deck." Right.
Yeah.
And they didn't like it. Doesn't make any logical sense. Like, why would you mix Lord of the Rings and Doctor Who? They're two separate things.
Right.
So I thought that was wild.
Yeah, that's so.
But
funny.
that's like a little peek into like what casual like Magic audience actually is. Right.
Right.
And so this brings up a great point, and another reason why I think vanilla creatures should be around is that you know, I talk about the player's journey a lot, and you want to start a player as far away from their like, obviously make sure the game is interesting to them, but start them as far away from ultimately where they end up as possible, so they have as much room to grow as possible. And without vanilla creatures as like baseline starting point, you're starting them that many steps ahead in the process.
Right. And I think that I understand. You have to have your set be exciting. It has to be enticing. It's got to be sexy, right? And the problem is when you've got your new Magic reveals, you've got your content creators revealing stuff. You've got like, what content creator wants to reveal Savannah Lions?
You know, it'll be really good. If like, let's say we eventually get a card to reveal, they give us a vanilla.
I would love it.
I would love it.
Yeah. It'll be Isamaru, but it's a 2/3.
Oh, yeah, exactly.
But like, I think that it's difficult because right now Magic is bigger than it's ever been.
Yeah.
And sets need to sell more than they've ever needed to sell in the past. And there's less and less room for you to be able to put in a vanilla creature and have it mean anything. I think mean anything meaningful to a audience that is heavily invested.
Well, it's kind of a compounding problem, right? Because if you continue to print cards that are more and more powerful, you get further and further and further away from vanilla creatures being able to even be relevant.
It's how you end up getting Yargle and Multani, where it's like, you want vanilla, like...
And it's still not even good enough.
And and it's still not good enough. People are like, haha, funny, and then they just don't do anything.
Yeah. And I wonder if they even expected it to have some kind of impact in like Commander too, and it's not good enough.
Well, what I love about Yargle and Multani is like when I was 14, if I saw that card, I'd be like, "This card's sick."
Yeah, and there's been various instances of that over the history of Magic, where you look at like Gigantosaurus or something, and it's a five green pips 10/10, and you're like, "Whoa!"
That's a card that I would have loved when I'm young. So I'm glad that they like have still done that, but hearing that they haven't done a monocolored vanilla since 2021 is wild.
Yeah.
Because I mean, for example, for those that don't know, because I'm a nerd, I looked at percentage rates of vanilla creatures and how many creatures were in the Magic 2010 core set, for instance. Now, core sets tended to lean a little bit more towards vanilla and French vanilla.
They were supposed to be an entry point,
and that's
players.
why I think it's a good way of comparing it.
Yeah.
The 2010 core set, 50% of the creatures in that set were either vanilla creatures or French vanilla creatures.
Right.
And I think even that was split pretty close down the middle.
French vanilla is
French vanilla,
like one keyword.
Right. I'd say
maybe two.
I'd say keywords.
But just
Right.
and usually keywords that are
Not
evergreen.
Evergreen. Yeah,
Stuff
right.
like
not,
trample,
not
flying.
set specific.
Yeah.
It's like one
Vigilance.
set specific or two evergreen keywords is probably what I'd consider French vanilla.
Right.
Everything else, even beyond that, is almost always like one effect. There was only like, I think maybe 3% or something like that of creatures that had like two effects, where it's like enter the battlefield and also this.
Right. And now we're looking at stuff like Questing Beast that has, 10 different abilities and keywords.
I mean, Questing Beast wasn't
still not good enough.
I was going to say Questing Beast wasn't that long ago, but I think we're even past
Yeah.
Questing Beast at this point.
Yeah. We used to measure things by grizzly bears, right? The 2/2 for 2. This is where the term hate bear comes from, which is a magic terminology for a 2/2 for 2 that has some kind of ability that hinders your opponent.
Mm-hmm.
But what was my point? We used to measure things by grizzly bear, but now when you look at 2/2s for 2, every color has a 2/2 for 2 creature except for blue, who has a 2/1, which trades with a 2/2, so it's really not that different. But like that sort of shows you how some of this like color identity, even at the vanilla level, has started to break down a bit. So what do we think can be done here in terms of getting them back? Like, are vanilla creatures dead forever, or is there potentially some way to kind of resurrect these things?
I think what's important to consider is that, and I think a lot of people probably already know this that have played the game, but power creep is an inevitability. It can be avoided, and Magic, I do want to point out, has done a fantastic job of avoiding power creep.
Up until fairly recently.
Recently. Even though they've always slowly power crept, but yeah, now it's like the power creep seems to be every year or two, maybe even every few months. Whereas
it's kind of every set.
right. Whereas previously, Isamaru came out in Kamigawa, which was 2004, 2003.
Somewhere in there.
And the game came out 10 years prior. So it took 10 years
to power creep Savannah Line. And it isn't even technically a power creep.
And it's not even technically power creep.
It's not to say power creep didn't exist in the game. It's just that specific example is a very good barometer.
Right.
But yeah, I think that some of the things that might be able to happen here is that if we got some kind of a new Magic entry product, and we sort of talked about the idea that there could be like a cube that Magic is selling for people to like start playing Magic from, and have it be a little bit more similar to like a living card game in that way, where you have a big chunk to start your collection off.
I think
great place for vanilla.
I think that'd be fantastic if they just came out with some big product that was, like you said, it can be played as a cube, so you can draft it.
Yeah.
But it's a bunch of pre-existing cards, maybe some new cards, but it's completely balanced as like, this is the standard. This is the new standard fundamentals of this game. And you sell it with a lot of alt art. That's how you end up selling it to new players that already
make sure
old
that there's
players.
Like staples in there that people are going to care about, obviously. But yeah, new art, new whatever. I think that would be really interesting to see.
Yeah.
The other thing is that you could look into Design Space. Okay, similar to Devotion. Devotion did something really interesting with the game that made monocolor creatures matter. Monocolor permanents matter a lot more, in that the more color pips you had, the bigger the effect. You could potentially do something like that with vanilla creatures, and there might already be some kind of commander that does this that I'm just not thinking of right now.
Yeah.
But that'd be something that could be interesting, is that you could have a vanilla creature commander. But even then, that's probably just going to pull from vanilla creatures from the past. I don't know.
I think that's still fine, because I still think it gives you the opportunity to experiment and bring vanilla creatures back in a way that might make an impact. So if you were to have some sort of a new product that came out, and it said, we discussed this a little bit before coming on and talking about this, but if you were somehow to evergreen keyword vanilla creatures, not call them vanilla, but call them something else.
Yeah, vanilla.
Don't say like
vanilla keyword. It's a vanilla creature with a keyword.
Yeah. That says vanilla. But if another card were to say, for every vanilla creature,
Right.
this thing happens.
Creature without ability.
Right.
Yeah.
Then it would allow you to actually sort of experiment more in that design space. And I know some games that do this. I think Marvel Snap might do this with some cards that don't have effects.
Oh, okay.
I think there's maybe some deck archetypes that do that. I could be mistaken. But I definitely think that there's opportunities there.
It's definitely design space that other games have explored. Magic has probably explored it somewhat, but I'm not 100% certain
Right.
what that has been. Part of the issue here with Magic is that their numbers are so low too that it's hard. Like, you're gonna take up the design space pretty rapidly unless you start power creeping the game, right? Like a 1 mana 2/2 is probably the best we're gonna do for now. Maybe a 2/3. Once you get into like a 3/2 for 1, now you've started to enter danger zone territory because of the impact it has on a health total. You know, that's a lightning bolt. That's a creature, right? Like,
It's also just so interesting because I think, like, when we talk about these small number changes, right, where it's like it's a big deal that a 2/1 went to a 2/2, it just seems like so non-consequential when you consider like formats like Commander. Like in Standard, when I'm looking at cards, for instance, like I said, if I'm playing mono red aggro, I'm looking at like what's the highest power total with haste that I could get away with to make this worthwhile. And there are cards that are currently played in Standard that's like a card with haste that's like a 3/3 or something.
Right.
And it is legendary, and that's how I think they kind of make up for it being sort of cheaper on that end for stats.
again, this is why set rotation matters so much, right? Because you can move into that 3/3 for 3 haste trample territory, and then you can move away from it and then back
Right.
to it without exponentially power creeping the game.
But right
Yeah.
now, if your main selling point is Commander, or it's even, getting into like Pioneer or Modern or Legacy, all these other formats, like everything outside of Standard, how do you end up selling a set and making it exciting? I think that they've done a good job of bringing in new mechanics, but I think in doing so and having to rely on that in order to keep things exciting, we end up having the death of the Isamarus of the world. And it's sad. But at least we can plot cards now.
Wizards committed the real crime. Killed Isamaru.
It's the real crime.